Hello everyone, welcome to SleepSpace. Tonight we will talk about what happens if someone dies under anesthesia. I'm really glad you're here. We're going to explore a topic that sounds frightening at first, but the deeper you go into it, the more it becomes a window into how strange consciousness, identity, and the body truly are. Tonight's journey will be calm, thoughtful, and grounded, but also open to the vast mystery of what happens when awareness disconnects from its usual anchor points in the brain and body. You can just settle in and let the ideas come to you gently. To start, think about the experience of anesthesia itself. It's often described as going to sleep, but everyone who studies the mind knows it's not sleep at all. Sleep has layers, fluctuations, dream cycles, and moments of micro-awareness. But anesthesia creates something different. A controlled erasing of consciousness. Not damaged, not destroyed, just temporarily switched off, like a lamp unplugged from the wall. The brain is still physically there, the neurons still humming with biology, but the subjective experience, your internal world, goes dark. What's fascinating is that even though doctors know how to administer anesthesia, and they understand the chemical pathways that suppress awareness, they still don't fully understand why consciousness disappears the way it does. They can explain which receptors are blocked, which signals are dampened, how the thalamus stops broadcasting information, but they can't explain consciousness itself. They can only describe the mechanics around it, not the essence. And that uncertainty becomes important when exploring a question as deep as death occurring during anesthesia. Anesthesia is one of the safest environments for the human body. Modern monitoring is so precise that every heartbeat, breath, and subtle shift in oxygen levels is tracked in real time. But the idea of death happening while consciousness is already offline makes people wonder, would you feel it? Would you know? Would there be any difference from simply being unconscious? Or does something else happen at that boundary between who you were and who you stopped being? To approach this gently, imagine the line between anesthesia and death as two different kinds of silence. The first silence, the anesthetic one, is a silence with structure. It's like stepping into a quiet, dark room, but the room still exists. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they're all there. You're simply not perceiving them. The body is alive, the brain is functioning, the metabolic engine is humming. You're just not present to witness any of it. When you wake up later, you experience what people describe as a cut in time, a jump from before the operation to after, with no sense of duration. That's the hallmark of anesthesia. Time ceases to exist because the experiencer is offline. Death, however, is a different silence. It's more like the room itself dissolves. It's not that the lights go out, it's that there's no more structure for the lights to turn on. Consciousness doesn't simply switch off. Instead, the biological framework that allowed consciousness to appear in the first place stops functioning permanently. So if someone were to die under anesthesia, the transition wouldn't be from awareness into death. It would be from unconsciousness into the cessation of the organism. This is where things get intriguing. One of the biggest fears people have about death is pain or suffering. But under anesthesia, those pathways are blocked. They're not active, they're not transmitting, they're not able to create subjective discomfort. In that sense, if biological failure occurred while under anesthesia, the subjective experience would be none at all. The person wouldn't feel themselves slipping away. They wouldn't realize anything was happening. It would be like a frozen frame in consciousness, a moment where time never resumed. But here's the part that invites deeper thought. If consciousness is absent during anesthesia, then what happens to the concept of you when the body dies, but the mind is already offline? Normally, near-death experiences come from situations where the brain is still trying to survive. Cardiac arrest, trauma, collapsing organs, extreme stress. Those states create a cascade of activity, surges of electrical discharges, last bursts of organized firing, flooding neurotransmitters. Some researchers believe this is where the vivid visions, tunnels of light and feelings of separation from the body arise. But under anesthesia, the brain is already quiet. Those surges may be blocked. The environment is chemically calm, so the experience of death from the inside may be different. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that removes the storm and replaces it with absolute stillness. This leads to the question, does consciousness require the brain to be in a particular state to produce final experiences? Or does it disconnect entirely when the brain is suppressed? People have studied cardiac arrest during surgery and found something remarkable. Sometimes, despite deep anesthesia, the brain still produces a last burst of organized energy when oxygen drops critically. It's not enough to wake the person, but it's something like a final signature of the neural network collapsing. Whether this generates any experience is unknown. No one has reported a memory from it, but the existence of the surge makes people wonder whether consciousness has layers even in quiet conditions. There's also a philosophical angle. The boundary between consciousness and non-consciousness may not be a gradual slope. It might be a sudden cliff. Imagine consciousness as a movie playing, but the projector only functions when certain circuits in the brain are synchronized. Under anesthesia, the projector is unplugged. Under death, the projector is destroyed. The movie doesn't fade out, it simply never starts again. But that also means that from the inside, there's no moment of ending. There's no awareness to register that something has stopped. The story doesn't conclude, it just doesn't resume. For those who believe in an after-consciousness, whatever form that might take, the scenario becomes even more intriguing. If the brain is suppressed and the body fails, does the transition occur differently than in a fully conscious death? Does the lack of panic, lack of sensory input, lack of emotional charge change anything about the nature of the transition? Some people think the passage would be smoother. Others believe the absence of mental noise would make the transition clearer, less entangled with fear or attachment. And then there are those who think consciousness doesn't survive biological death at all, meaning that the moment of passing under anesthesia simply has no subjective component. Regardless of belief, the central mystery remains. Consciousness is the only thing we directly experience, yet we have almost no understanding of what it fundamentally is. And anesthesia is one of the rare tools humans have that can make consciousness disappear without harming the brain. In that sense, anesthesia reveals something profound, that your sense of self is tied to delicate, reversible patterns in the brain. And when those patterns are interrupted, you vanish completely, only to re-emerge when the conditions are right again. But death, unlike anesthesia, does not offer a return. It does not provide a reboot. It marks the endpoint of the system that generates experience. And so, if someone dies under anesthesia, the experience is not a journey. It is the absence of journey, the absence of awareness that anything has happened. It is the cleanest, quietest boundary between being and not being. No fear, no pain, no struggle, just a self that never comes back online. Yet this leads to a surprising realization. The thing we call you is more fragile and more mysterious than we usually admit. You can disappear for hours under anesthesia, and the world continues to move. Events unfold, things happen to your body, people speak, machines monitor, and you have no record of any of it. You vanish from your own timeline, and when you return, you never question the gap. You simply accept that the person you were before the anesthesia and the person you are after are seamlessly the same, even though there was a period where you did not exist as an experiencer. So what does that say about the nature of the self? Is the self continuous because it truly continues, or because you assume continuity when you wake up? If death happens while you are in that non-continuous state, then the story ends at the last moment you were conscious, not at the biological moment of death. Your final conscious moment already occurred earlier, before the anesthesia took hold. The body dies later, but the subjective story of the person ended before the event. This concept is strangely comforting. It means that what people often fear, the moment of death, is something they may never experience at all. The conscious you is long gone before the biological failure happens. The self ends at the last moment of awareness, not the moment the heart stops. Everything after that is the closing of a book with no reader. And the more we understand consciousness, the more it becomes clear that the boundary between awareness and nothingness is not something you feel. It's simply a shift from being present to being absent. No transition, no sensation, no moment to fear, just a clean line. That's the essence of what makes this topic both profound and strangely peaceful. It takes something terrifying and reframes it into something quiet, something without pain, something without drama. And maybe that's why so many people are curious about it. It touches the deepest human fear, but the answer is gentler than expected. Most people think of anesthesia as simply being knocked out, but the state is far more complex. It's not real sleep, and it's not death. It sits in a narrow, precisely monitored zone where the body is alive, reactive, carefully supported, yet completely severed from the subjective experience of existence. And in that silent gap where the self is absent, the body continues its tasks without any witness inside it. Once consciousness is turned off, your brain becomes something like a quiet server that's still plugged in but not running any active programs. The machinery hums in the background, performing essential maintenance tasks, regulating breathing if it's allowed to, signaling the heart, maintaining temperature, running metabolic cycles. But nothing is writing memories. Nothing is building the narrative of experience. In this state, the body is extremely vulnerable, but it's also extraordinarily monitored. Machines stand in for your awareness. Alarms replace your intuition. Numbers substitute for sensation. Every function that you, as a conscious being, normally oversee in some indirect way is instead overseen by professionals and sensors. And yet for all that, it is still a biological system, and biological systems can fail. To see how this failure differs under anesthesia, imagine watching a grand orchestra. When you're awake, your brain is like an orchestra playing a complex symphony of awareness. Thoughts move like melodies, emotions like harmonies, sensations like steady percussion. When anesthesia is administered, the conductor walks off stage and the musicians fall silent, but they remain in their seats. The instruments are still there. The structure is intact. The potential for music remains, but no sound is produced. If death were to occur during this silence, it wouldn't involve the disordered collapse that happens in trauma or crisis. It wouldn't be accompanied by panic signals, emotional flooding, or the desperate neural fireworks that come when a conscious brain tries to save itself. Instead, it would be more like the musicians quietly leaving the stage one by one, until the orchestra is gone entirely. No music, no collapse, just absence. To understand why this is important, we can look at what scientists have discovered about the brain's response to dying. In recent years, a lot of attention has been given to what happens in the brain immediately after the heart stops working. In awake individuals, there's often a sudden surge of neural activity, a sharp, synchronized burst that looks surprisingly organized. Some people think this could be responsible for out-of-body experiences or visions reported in near-death situations. But under anesthesia, those pathways are dimmed. The lights are already turned low. The system may not generate the same final sparks. In fact, studies show that anesthetic drugs suppress the very networks that normally produce near-death-like phenomena. The areas that generate imagery, emotion, and the sense of self become inactive. The chemicals create a blockade that keeps the brain calm, even as oxygen decreases. So if the body fails, if the heart stops, if blood pressure drops beyond recovery, the brain might not enter a dramatic life flashing before your eyes sequence. Instead, it might simply drift deeper into non-functionality. This isn't frightening, it's clarifying. It shows that the subjective experience of dying under anesthesia may be no experience at all. Not muted, not slowed, simply non-existent. The person's story of consciousness ended at the moment anesthesia took hold, long before the body gave out. But this understanding opens up another question. If there is no final experience, no internal witness to the body's shutdown, what does that say about the structure of consciousness itself? Does consciousness only exist when certain circuits are firing? If those circuits are prevented from firing, even when the body is in danger, does the self simply remain absent? Or is there some deeper layer that remains untouched? To explore that, think about the fragile way memory is built. Memory requires the hippocampus and cortex to communicate, to encode time, sensation, identity, and experience. Under anesthesia, the communication is interrupted. No new memories are formed. That's why people have no recollection of anything that happens, even if the surgical team talks, moves the body, performs intricate procedures. No matter how active the outside world is, the inner recorder is off. But memory formation is only one branch of consciousness. Awareness is another, and selfhood is something deeper still. Consider the idea that consciousness might be like a flame produced by the activity of the brain. Anesthesia doesn't extinguish the flame permanently. It just removes the oxygen feeding it. The potential for flame remains, but the fire goes out. When the drugs wear off and the conditions change, the flame can be reignited. But if the body fails before the drugs wear off, then the flame simply never returns. There is no dramatic extinguishing, no moment where the flame sputters out in awareness. It was already out. Some people find this concept unsettling because it implies consciousness can disappear completely without the self noticing, but others find it deeply peaceful. It suggests that the boundary between existence and non-existence doesn't need to be traumatic or dramatic. It can be quiet, almost gentle. If the mind is already gone, then there's no one left to experience the ending. However, some theories complicate this. There are researchers who believe consciousness is not entirely dependent on the waking state networks of the brain. They argue that some forms of awareness continue in deep states, such as certain kinds of dreaming, meditation, or even unconscious perception. Under this view, even if the classic circuits of consciousness are blocked by drugs, some kind of internal processing might continue below the threshold of awareness. If this is true, then the question becomes, could the dying brain under anesthesia have a subtle, hidden experience? Something not recordable, not memorable, not cognitive, but still present? A final impression, a final sensation? We don't know. There's no direct evidence. And because the brain under anesthesia is heavily inhibited, many scientists believe any such experience is extremely unlikely. But consciousness remains one of the most mysterious phenomena in existence. And people have reported extraordinary things upon waking from near-death events that occurred after anesthetic complications. Memories of places, feelings, images, sensations. These are rare, but they hover at the edges of scientific understanding, suggesting we don't fully know what the mind is capable of at the boundary of death. Of course, most of these experiences likely occurred during moments where the anesthesia had worn off slightly, or where the brain became more active due to physiological stress. A fully suppressed brain typically doesn't generate complex experiences. Still, the fact that some memories appear at all makes the question richer. It raises the possibility that even in conditions where awareness is unlikely, the mind might create a final echo. But even if such an echo does exist, it would be shaped entirely by the brain's chemistry, not by suffering. The pathways responsible for pain, panic, or fear are among the first to be silenced under anesthesia. The circuits that generate distress are suppressed before the deepest unconsciousness occurs. So even if there is some residual processing as the body fails, it would not involve the emotional turmoil that people associate with death. It would be something more neutral, more dreamlike if it occurs at all. Another aspect worth exploring is the difference between clinical death and biological death. Clinical death refers to the moment when the heart stops beating and blood stops flowing. Biological death refers to the point at which the cells of the body begin to break down irreversibly. Under anesthesia, if the heart stops, doctors immediately intervene. CPR begins. Machines take over breathing. Surgeries might shift suddenly into emergency mode. In these situations, people are sometimes revived, and when they are, they often have no memories of anything that happened after they went unconscious. This shows an interesting truth. If a person were to die under anesthesia and then be resuscitated, they might never know they had died. They would wake up with the same blank timeline they always have under anesthesia. No sensation of crisis, no awareness that anything happened. From the perspective of consciousness, it would be as though the death never occurred. This leads to a curious idea. The subjective experience of dying under anesthesia is indistinguishable from not dying at all. In both cases, there is no story, no awareness, and no internal record. The only difference is whether the body happens to resume functioning afterward. Life or death, the consciousness remains equally silent. But what about the moments before anesthesia takes effect? Some people worry that anesthesia might fail, that they might be aware during surgery or feel something as their body declines. This fear is understandable, but statistically incredibly rare. Modern anesthesia combines multiple drugs that suppress awareness, memory, and pain separately. Even if one drug is metabolized unusually fast, the others continue to provide protection. And if an emergency occurs, the medical team is trained to immediately deepen sedation rather than lighten it. The broader point is that the person undergoing anesthesia enters a state where the body is handled with precision, and the mind is completely insulated from the physical world. The body can struggle, fail, or recover without the mind being present for any of it. This separation between body and consciousness is profound, and perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of being human. The mind is not necessary for the body to operate, and the body can undergo extraordinary events while the mind is absent. That brings us to a deeper philosophical question. If the self is absent during anesthesia, and the body dies in that state, where does the you end? At the moment of anesthesia or the moment of biological death? If identity is tied to conscious experience, then the story ends the instant the drugs take effect. The remainder, the physiological shutdown, the medical efforts, the final biological moments, are part of the body's timeline, not the mind's. This means that, in a way, the end of the person already happened earlier. The moment of awareness, thought, perspective, that moment is the final chapter of the conscious story. Everything after that is the closing of the book by hands that no longer belong to the reader. This leads to an unusual insight. Dying under anesthesia is not a continuation of life into death. It's more like the ending occurs long before the physical body stops. It reframes the entire concept of final moments. They aren't the moments where the heart falters. They're the moments of fading awareness before the anesthetic takes hold. Those are the true endpoints of subjective experience. But there's another layer to this, the transition into anesthesia itself. For some people, that moment feels peaceful, like drifting. For others, it's sudden, like stepping through a doorway. And for a small number, it's accompanied by strange sensations, visual distortions, moments of clarity, fragments of dreamlike imagery. These moments, fleeting as they are, might be the actual final experiences if the body fails afterward. The last perceptions, the last thoughts, the last sensations. They become the last page of the internal story. And there's something strangely poetic about that. The final moment of consciousness in life might not be pain or fear or chaos, but the gentle drifting sensation of letting go, the soft dissolve of awareness, the calm surrender into nothingness. To go deeper into what happens if someone dies under anesthesia, it's important to explore the territory that lies between consciousness, unconsciousness, and the complete dissolution of self. This space isn't just biological, it's philosophical, psychological, and sometimes almost metaphysical. Humans have tried for centuries to understand what it means to vanish from one's own experience. But anesthesia is one of the only controlled situations where that vanishing happens predictably, safely, and without trauma. And when you combine that controlled disappearance with the possibility of death, you get a window into one of the most profound questions imaginable. What does it mean for a person to cease existing when they're already gone from their own mind? To start, consider how unusual the anesthetized state is. Even though the brain is technically alive, the consciousness is not engaged. The neural circuits that create awareness are disconnected from themselves. Information still flows in the brain, signals still travel through the nervous system, organs still communicate, reflexes still operate. But those processes aren't being woven into the tapestry of subjective experience. There's no observer inside. The brain loses not just the sense of I, but the very ability to construct the world around that I. If death happens while the mind is already off, it means the self doesn't witness its own ending. Without awareness, there is no fear, no anticipation, no realization. The body simply crosses a threshold the mind had already stepped away from. It's like the main character of a story walking out of the room long before the final scene happens. The end of the story still occurs, but the character never sees it. This brings up a deep truth. Consciousness and the body do not die at the same moment. Consciousness ends when the brain can no longer support the patterns that create awareness. Under anesthesia, those patterns are shut down prematurely and artificially. Death, on the other hand, ends the biological machinery itself. When death happens during anesthesia, the mind's ending has already occurred earlier. The remaining process is purely physical. This separation opens the door to look at death not as a dramatic final moment, but as the continuation of a process the mind no longer participates in. To explore this further, imagine two timelines, the mental and the biological. The mental timeline ends at the last moment of consciousness before the anesthetic takes full effect. That moment might be peaceful drifting, a slight fuzziness around the edges of perception, or a sudden cut to silence. That is, in effect, the individual's last subjective moment. The biological timeline continues afterward, breathing supported, heart monitored, organs functioning in the background. If something goes wrong and the body fails, the biological timeline ends later. But because there is no awareness bridging the gap between the two timelines, the person never experiences the transition from being alive to not being alive. To the individual, the story ended earlier. That raises a compelling question. If a person dies under anesthesia, is the final moment of consciousness the real moment of death for the self? If identity is tied to experience, then perhaps yes. The biological end is simply the final page of the physical vessel, not the true ending of the conscious story. This idea becomes more interesting when you consider what scientists know about the moments leading up to unconsciousness. People often describe anesthesia induction as slipping, floating, or melting away. Some describe a gentle warmth spreading through their body. Others experience a peculiar moment of detachment, as though they are stepping away from their own thoughts. Still others feel nothing at all, simply one moment here and the next moment gone. If that is the final moment of awareness, then for someone who never wakes again, that soft transition, calm, undisturbed, without fear, becomes the last experience their mind ever has. There is no pain, no suffering, no awareness of loss. There is simply a drift into non-existence. But there's another layer to this. Even though anesthesia is designed to remove consciousness, the brain does not become inactive. It shifts into a different pattern, one that resembles certain stages of deep sleep. This pattern is defined by slow, controlled oscillations. These oscillations create a closed loop inside the brain, where signals circulate internally rather than forming connections with external stimuli. It's like a system that's humming, but only to itself. No input, no output. This is important because some theories suggest that consciousness might arise from the brain's ability to integrate information across different regions. When integration stops, awareness stops. Under anesthesia, integration is deliberately blocked. If the body dies in this state, there is no return to integration, no reactivation of the circuits that could support awareness. The last opportunity for consciousness existed before the anesthesia took hold. After that point, the system is incapable of producing the experience of being. That said, there are cases where people have come close to dying under anesthesia, but were revived. When they wake up, they describe nothing, not even a sense of time. They don't report dreams, visions, or impressions of the moment their body was in crisis. They often wake as if nothing unusual happened at all. This complete absence of experience reinforces the idea that the mind was entirely disconnected from the body's emergency. It also suggests something profound. The fear we associate with death often comes from imagining ourselves conscious during the event. But under anesthesia, consciousness is not present. The thing we fear does not reach us. The body's struggle is not ours. The crisis is not felt. The moment is not lived. However, in rare cases where anesthesia is not perfectly deep or where the brain enters certain borderline states, fragments of awareness can surface, not enough to create distress, but enough to hint at the complexity of the mind. People sometimes recall hearing a sound or feeling a vague presence. Not pain, not discomfort, just faint impressions. These rare fragments show that consciousness is not a simple switch, but a spectrum. It can fade, rise, flicker, and dissolve. If death occurs in such a borderline state, could the person have a final fleeting impression? Possibly, though extremely unlikely. Such an impression wouldn't be fear-based. It would be more like a drifting thought, a dream fragment, a sense of something shifting. But in the vast majority of cases, anesthesia holds consciousness firmly in silence, long before the body's condition becomes critical. This silence leads to another important point. Because anesthesia suspends the self, death under anesthesia is not experientially different from dying in your sleep. There is no realization, no moment of recognition, no internal narrative concluding. And because there is no awareness, the experience cannot be frightening. Fear requires a conscious mind. Without one, there is no fear. But this brings us to a deeper philosophical question. What happens to the subjective sense of time? Under anesthesia, time disappears completely. People often describe it as a cut or jump. One moment before anesthesia, the next after waking, with no in-between. If a person never wakes, then their timeline ends at the last moment. They were aware time itself simply stops for them. They do not experience waiting, drifting, dissolving, or transitioning. From their perspective, it is not that they died during the operation. It is that they never returned after that last conscious breath. The idea may sound existential, but it also removes the terror associated with imagining death as a conscious event. For someone under anesthesia, death does not occur to them in the experiential sense. It occurs to the body, to the organism, to the structure, but not to the self. One of the strangest aspects of anesthesia is how it reveals the fragility of consciousness. People think they are solid, continuous beings. They imagine that awareness is a constant stream. But anesthesia shows that the stream can be interrupted so cleanly that you disappear and reappear later with no awareness of the gap. And if the reappearance never comes, the gap never becomes part of your story. This perspective leads to an important realization. The final experience of life is not death itself, but the final moment of consciousness before unconsciousness. The end happens earlier than we expect. The true boundary is not the physical failure of the body, but the moment the brain stops producing awareness. This idea, though simple, profoundly changes the way people think about mortality. It means that even if there is fear surrounding the idea of dying during surgery, the actual subjective experience would be one of gentle transition into darkness. Not into fear, not into chaos, but into the same kind of peaceful nothingness that occurs every time anesthesia takes hold. The difference is simply that the story does not start again. Another way to look at it is through the lens of continuity. Consciousness is like a path. When anesthesia interrupts that path, it creates a gap. On the other side of the gap, you normally continue walking. If the body dies during the gap, you simply never resume walking. There is no fall, no stumble, no awareness of stopping. The path just ends. But the lack of awareness doesn't mean the event is meaningless. For the people in the operating room, the moment is dramatic, significant. Emotional doctors rush. Alarms sound, interventions begin. But for the individual, none of this enters the story. The external world loses its connection to the internal world. The external still exists. The internal no longer does. This brings up another point. People often talk about dying peacefully as something that happens in a soft bed or a calm environment. But anesthesia offers something even more distinct, a complete removal of consciousness long before death, making it one of the most peaceful ways the mind could cease. Not because death itself is peaceful, but because the self is no longer present to witness it. The idea that the self ends before the body does challenges many assumptions people carry about mortality. It suggests that the body's final moments belong to biology, not to identity. The self, the observer, the experiencer, those vanish early, quietly, gently. To keep exploring what happens when someone dies under anesthesia, we need to shift the focus toward a part of this mystery that is rarely discussed but quietly profound. What happens in the body during the final minutes when the mind is completely absent? This part of the story isn't about fear or suffering, because under anesthesia, those systems are offline. Instead, it's about unraveling the moment when a living biological machine reaches its limits while the conscious self is already gone. It reveals something unexpected about what it means to be alive when the experiencer is no longer present inside the experience. The first thing to understand is that anesthesia doesn't stop the body from functioning. It simply isolates the mind from the body's internal processes. Breathing might be controlled by machines. The heartbeat continues on its own, guided by the electrical rhythm of the heart's pacemaker cells. The blood moves, the organs maintain their cycles. Even though the conscious self has stepped out of the picture, the body continues operating as a coordinated network. If the person ultimately dies under anesthesia, the beginning of that process often has nothing to do with consciousness at all. It's mechanical, chemical, or biological. A sudden heart rhythm problem, a hidden vulnerability, a clot, a stroke, a failure of oxygen. These events are part of the body's physical storyline, events that occur in tissues, vessels, and cells. And because the mind is absent, the body continues attempting to correct these failures without any awareness behind it. This is where the experience becomes fundamentally different from dying while awake. When someone collapses awake, the conscious mind feels the shift. There is fear, confusion, sensation, and a final set of impressions. But under anesthesia, the mind is not present to register any of it. The body enters crisis alone, silently, without the presence of the observer that normally interprets its signals. This creates a strange duality. Externally, the situation may be urgent, dramatic, nurses rushing, alarms sounding, doctors intervening with precision. Internally, inside the person's subjective universe, there is nothing. No awareness, no reaction, no final moment of clarity. It is like the lights have been turned out long before the storm arrives. This absence of inner experience makes the concept of a final moment surprisingly complicated. Normally, people imagine their final moment as something they will be present for, a last thought, a last breath, a last experience of being. But under anesthesia, that moment never comes. The inner narrative simply cuts off earlier, and what follows is the body executing its final sequence without a witness. To understand why this matters, consider consciousness as the narrator of a story. When anesthesia removes consciousness, the narrator sets the book down and walks away. But the story, in a biological sense, keeps going in the background. The characters keep acting. the plot continues, but the one who would understand, interpret, or remember it is no longer there. If the body dies during this part of the story, then the final scene happens without the narrator ever returning. The story ends in the physical world, but internally it ended before the anesthesia even took hold completely. This may sound philosophical, but it's grounded in science. The subjective experience of life requires active, connected neural networks. Anesthesia deliberately disconnects those networks. A disconnected brain cannot experience a final moment. Another fascinating part of this question is what happens electrically inside the brain during the final seconds of life. In conscious deaths, heart attacks, sudden trauma, cardiac arrest, scientists have found that the brain sometimes produces a burst of energy. A final surge, almost like a last attempt at organization. Some people have speculated that this may produce visions or the familiar tunnel of light phenomena described in near-death experiences. But under anesthesia, that surge may be heavily altered or suppressed. The drugs used to maintain unconsciousness hinder the very circuits that would normally produce that last burst. This means the dying brain under anesthesia might fade out more quietly. Less electrical activity, less neural storm, less structured firing. The decline could be smooth, gradual, almost entirely silent. Whether this means there is absolutely no final experience is still debated, but based on what is known about neural suppression, it is extremely unlikely that a person would have any coherent experience as the brain collapses under anesthetic conditions. The mind has already been turned off long before the physical failure begins. However, something else happens during the final biological moments, something that gives insight into the boundary between life and non-life. The body doesn't instantly switch off when the heart stops or when oxygen drops. Different cells and tissues have different tolerances for losing oxygen. Some die within seconds. Others can last minutes. Some neural circuits survive longer than others. If consciousness were present, these final flickers might produce sensations. But in the anesthetized brain, the circuits responsible for awareness, particularly the thalamus, cortex, and prefrontal networks, are already shut down. The cells may still be alive temporarily, but they're not communicating in a way that produces experience. Think of it like a city where the power grid has been shut down. Even if some buildings still have backup batteries, the street lights are off, the traffic systems are dark, and everything is disconnected. Lights might flicker here and there, but no one is inside to see them. The city's structure remains for a while, but its inner life is gone. This leads to another surprising realization. The body often continues trying to survive even after consciousness is no longer possible. The heart might attempt to restart, reflexive movements may occur. Hormones rush to stabilize blood pressure. Every system tries to compensate, but none of these processes reach the conscious self. They are biological survival mechanisms occurring in an empty house. What makes this even stranger is that the body sometimes continues this struggle for minutes, or even longer, even though the conscious timeline ended much earlier. It raises a powerful question. If the mind is not present, is the person still experiencing life at all? Or is the body simply running through its final programmed responses? Most evidence suggests the latter. The physical body performs its final attempts at survival without producing subjective experience. It's a body acting without a mind, a biological structure finishing its last steps. This separation between body and consciousness leads to another important point. The concept of time becomes completely different from the perspective of the self. If someone dies under anesthesia, the person does not experience time between the last conscious moment and the cessation of biological function. Time exists only for the people outside the individual, not for the self inside. Internally, the last instant of awareness is the final entry in the timeline. The gap between that moment and the actual death might be minutes or hours, but to the person, that gap does not exist at all. It's not even darkness, it's a missing piece of existence, a space where time never occurred. This brings up one of the deepest and most difficult questions in all of neuroscience and philosophy. Is the self a continuous entity that moves through time, or is it something that emerges only when the right conditions are met? Anesthesia suggests the latter. The self appears only when the brain supports it. When the brain no longer supports it, even temporarily, the self disappears. If the body dies in that state, the self never reappears. The last moment of consciousness becomes the final moment of existence. But there is yet another angle to consider, one that adds complexity to this seemingly clean explanation. Throughout history, humans have wondered whether consciousness is something produced entirely by the brain, or whether it is something that can exist independently of the brain. Anesthesia challenges both ideas. On one hand, it clearly demonstrates that consciousness depends on physical conditions. Change those conditions, and consciousness vanishes. On the other hand, it reveals something strange. The subjective self does not resist disappearing. It doesn't panic or cling. It simply ceases. If consciousness was something separate from the brain, why would it vanish so neatly when the brain circuits are blocked? Why would it not persist as some form of awareness? And yet, the complete absence of subjective experience under anesthesia does not answer the mystery. It deepens it. Because if consciousness is entirely a product of brain activity, then what exactly is it? How does a network of neurons produce an inner world? Why does awareness arise at all? And if death under anesthesia means the mind never experiences its own ending, what does that say about the nature of being? These questions don't have clear answers, but the process of disappearing under anesthesia teaches something profound. Consciousness can stop without suffering, without awareness, and without resistance. It can quietly dissolve, leaving the body to continue its physical journey alone. And if the body happens to die in that state, then the transition from life to non-life is one of pure silence. If consciousness is not something that simply switches off, then whatever happens during that silent interval under anesthesia may not be as empty as it seems. This brings us to a strange possibility, one that has fascinated researchers, philosophers, and anyone who has ever wondered what really goes on beneath that perfectly still exterior. When someone goes into cardiac arrest or suffers a fatal complication under anesthesia and then is revived, they sometimes report experiences that defy the logic of a brain supposedly shut down or in crisis. These moments raise the question, if consciousness can operate outside the normal channels of the brain, what does that mean for the moments when you are hovering between life and death? Let's start with what the brain normally does during anesthesia. Under ideal conditions, the networks responsible for keeping your sense of self unified, the parietal lobe, frontal cortex, and deeper thalamic hubs, go quiet. This is not the chaotic shutdown of sleep or fainting. It's more like a carefully controlled dimming of the lights in a mansion room, by room, until only a small emergency lamp remains. That dim emergency lamp is your most basic awareness, the part that monitors the body's internal state and would normally alert you to danger or pain. With anesthesia, even that system is dampened, leaving the brain in a strange, curated stillness. But when something goes wrong, like oxygen deprivation, sudden drops in blood pressure, or cardiac arrest, the brain does not simply flicker out like an unplugged device. Instead, in many documented cases, it appears to surge. Instead of going dark, the electrical activity shoots upward in a pattern that resembles the brain waking up or entering a high-focus state. This paradoxical spike is one reason researchers think meaningful conscious experiences might happen even when the body appears unresponsive. People who have been revived from such episodes often describe vivid perceptions, floating above the operating table, hearing conversations in the room, seeing light or feeling as if they were watching events from a detached vantage point. Some describe entering spaces that feel both familiar and beyond anything they've ever known. Landscapes that seem symbolic, encounters with figures who feel important, or sensations of clarity and perspective. One theory proposes that when the brain is starved of oxygen or pushed into a sudden crisis, it releases a massive burst of neurotransmitters that produce extreme, hyper-real experiences. Another theory suggests that the brain's normal filtering mechanisms, the ones that keep your awareness tethered to the body, temporarily malfunction, creating the illusion of separation or movement. But there's another possibility, harder to measure yet persistent across cultures and reports, that consciousness may not be entirely generated by the brain at all, that it might be something the brain channels, shapes, or receives, like a radio signal carried through a biological antenna. If that were true, then the moments when the brain is destabilized, whether through anesthesia, cardiac arrest, or a life-threatening complication, might be moments when consciousness slips into a different configuration, not gone, not lost, but freed from the usual constraints. In this view, the experience of dying under anesthesia wouldn't be a blank void, but a rearrangement of awareness taking place in the background while the physical self undergoes crisis. Some revived patients describe experiences that line up with what was happening in the operating room, word for word, down to the movements of the surgical team or the positioning of instruments. These reports challenge the assumption that a non-functioning brain cannot perceive anything. Critics argue that these memories may be reconstructed after the fact or based on residual hearing, but the precision of some accounts has forced scientists to take them more seriously. Another group of experiences involve intense personal reflection. People report seeing their lives unfold with a sense of detachment, not as a sequence of memories, but as a single interconnected tapestry. Everything they ever felt, everything they ever caused, every moment played out not from their viewpoint, but from the viewpoints of others. Some describe feeling the emotional weight of their interactions, good or bad, with a clarity that leaves them transformed after revival. This life review phenomenon doesn't map neatly onto any known brain process. Memory doesn't work that way. You don't have access to a complete, panoramic version of your life. Memories change and fade. Yet during these events, people report something far more cohesive than the brain typically offers. This leads to another idea, that when the physical structures maintaining your usual sense of time and identity falter, you may gain access to layers of awareness normally inaccessible. But what if these experiences are not just illusions generated by a stressed brain? What if the collapse of the body's systems opens a doorway to the deeper architecture of consciousness, something fundamental rather than biological? When someone dies under anesthesia, the medical team works furiously to restart the heart, restore oxygen, or stabilize the blood pressure. From the outside, the body is entirely still. But from the inside, from the perspective of consciousness itself, the experience might be far more active. Imagine existing in a space where time doesn't operate the way it normally does, where moments stretch like soft clay, where memories and sensations blend together, where the sense of a fixed identity becomes permeable. This strange mental territory might feel like floating, or watching from above, or entering a place that seems symbolic because it's constructed out of meaning rather than physical form. It might feel like clarity or expansion or unraveling. It might be terrifying or peaceful or completely neutral. The reports vary, but they all share one theme. The experience feels real. Not dreamlike, not imagined. Real in a way that stays with people for the rest of their lives. Some researchers believe that what people encounter in such moments is the result of the brain trying to make sense of its own collapse. The brain may be processing signals from different regions out of sync, creating a fragmented yet vivid picture. But others propose that when the brain stops anchoring consciousness to the physical world, consciousness may briefly operate independently without the normal filtering and interpretation. This idea that consciousness could persist even when the brain is offline is controversial, but it keeps resurfacing because of the consistency in these reports. People describe similar sensations despite coming from different backgrounds, cultures, and belief systems. They use different words but point to the same strange territory, a feeling of being both themselves and more than themselves, of observing without a body, of existing in a space where time feels elastic. Now imagine that happening under anesthesia, a space already designed to remove your awareness from the physical world. If consciousness does have the ability to operate outside the brain's usual circuits, then anesthesia might create a perfect storm. The body immobilized, the senses shut down, the ego quieted, and the brain destabilized just enough in crisis to let something else take shape. This doesn't mean that everyone who dies under anesthesia experiences something extraordinary. Many people report nothing at all after resuscitation, but the absence of memory doesn't mean the absence of experience. It may simply mean that the experience didn't form the kind of impressions that translate into recall. But what about the people who don't come back? If consciousness can persist even briefly beyond the brain's collapse, then the period after death under anesthesia might not be an instant blank. It might be a gradual shift, awareness releasing its grip on the physical world, moving through whatever inner landscape emerges as the biological structures fall away. This is not about predicting what happens after death. That remains beyond measurement. It's about acknowledging that the boundary between biological shutdown and conscious experience is not as clear-cut as once believed. The most intriguing aspect is that many people who return from these experiences describe them as more real than their ordinary lives. Colors seem brighter, sensations more meaningful, emotions more integrated. This has led some neuroscientists to speculate that the default mode of consciousness, the filtered, practical version we live in day to day, might be only one layer of a much larger system. Anesthesia and near-death states may temporarily remove those filters, revealing deeper layers that are always present but inaccessible. In this view, dying under anesthesia isn't a leap into nothingness. It's a movement into a different mode of awareness, one that the brain normally protects you from because it wouldn't be practical to experience that depth while trying to live everyday life. When the physical systems fail, those protective barriers collapse, and consciousness may expand into spaces it usually never reaches. Another aspect worth considering is the role of time. Nearly all revived patients describe their experiences as happening outside normal time. A sense of timelessness or time being irrelevant is almost universal. This suggests that whatever state they enter, real or generated, operates on a different mode of processing. Without time, identity becomes fluid. Without a body, location becomes meaningless. Without memory in the normal sense, awareness may not track events, but instead experience existence directly. And so the moment of dying under anesthesia might feel like a transition into a state where awareness no longer depends on the brain's structure. A state where perception is not tied to senses, where thought is not tied to language, where identity is not tied to the body. It might be brief or expansive or impossible to describe once someone returns to their normal state, but something about it lingers in the people who've felt it. There's another possibility too, something more grounded, that the intensity of near-death experiences is part of the brain's last attempt to maintain order, to create meaning out of chaos. But even this interpretation leads to fascinating territory. If the dying brain attempts to give you one last coherent experience, one last narrative, one last insight, what does that suggest about the importance of consciousness? Why would the brain, in its final moments, generate a sense of clarity, or peace, or perspective, instead of dissolving into confusion? These questions don't yet have answers, but they reveal something profound. The experience of dying, even under anesthesia, might be far more complex than a simple shutdown. Whether the mind generates these experiences internally or taps into something beyond itself, the moment of crossing the threshold of life remains a deeply active transition. And so the idea of dying under anesthesia sits at a fascinating intersection of biology, psychology, and mystery. It's a moment when the body is controlled and still, when the brain is muffled, yet consciousness may be undergoing one of the most profound transitions it will ever face. The stillness on the outside may hide an extraordinary inner event, a fleeting burst of insight or expansion or release, as awareness encounters a state it has never touched before. As we follow the path of what might unfold in those final moments under anesthesia, there's one dimension left to explore. What happens if consciousness does continue its journey after the body has crossed the threshold, and what that means for the quiet return into ordinary awareness? Because for many people who have come close to death and survived, what they experienced in those moments doesn't vanish when the heart restarts. It lingers. It reshapes them. It becomes a quiet echo that follows them back into their lives, influencing their thoughts, their relationships, even the way they see the world. In some cases, revived patients describe a profound shift in their understanding of themselves. It's as though the experience wiped the slate clean of certain fears and replaced them with a deeper sense of clarity. One person might say they lost their fear of death entirely. Another might say they feel more connected to others. Another might say the boundaries that once defined their life, job, reputation, expectations, now feel strangely light, almost trivial. These transformations often come with no clear explanation. Medical science can tell you what happened physically. It can map the circulation restored, the electrical impulses realigned, the breathing stabilized, but it can't fully account for why so many people return with the same emotional signatures. A sense of expansion, gratitude, or profound reorientation. One hypothesis is that the moment of near death triggers a type of psychological integration that rarely happens under normal circumstances. Maybe the brain, pushed into crisis, reorients itself around what truly matters. Maybe it's a survival mechanism, some kind of built-in mental rebalancing meant to help you move forward. But again, that doesn't fully explain the intensity or consistency of these shifts. Another perspective suggests that what people experience in those moments might not be symbolic or manufactured at all. Instead, it may be a direct encounter with consciousness without its usual filters, without distraction, without the noise of daily life, without the constant self-narration that shapes identity. This unfiltered state could feel liberating, like stepping outside a story you didn't realize you were trapped inside. And when you return to ordinary awareness, the memory of that wider vantage point lingers. Some revived patients describe seeing patterns in their lives they never noticed before. Consequences, connections, meanings. It's as though the experience gave them a vantage point from which everything made a kind of sense that cannot be easily articulated afterward. Others describe a kind of lightness, not happiness exactly, but a sense that there's more to existence than what we usually perceive. This brings us to one of the most compelling possibilities, that consciousness might be layered. Most of the time, we operate on the surface layer, the one shaped by our senses, habits, memories, and expectations. It's practical, functional, grounded in survival. But beneath that surface layer, there may be deeper levels of awareness that hold broader perspectives, larger memory networks, or even entirely different ways of perceiving reality. Under normal circumstances, the brain restricts access to those layers because it would be overwhelming to live daily life with that expanded awareness. But in moments of extreme crisis, when the brain's usual controls fail, those deeper layers might open. If consciousness really does have depth, then what happens under anesthesia during a death event could be a brief entry into that deeper layer, not because the brain wants it, but because the collapse of the ordinary systems creates an unusual opening. The person might experience peace because the deeper layer perceives differently. They might experience clarity because the deeper layer processes information more holistically. They might experience a life review because the deeper layer holds memories in a way the surface mind can't. This layered consciousness model doesn't require anything supernatural. It simply suggests that the brain, complex as it is, may operate like an ocean, mostly calm at the surface, but full of powerful, unseen currents beneath. When the surface breaks, whether through anesthesia, trauma, or cardiac arrest, the deeper water may momentarily rise. But what if the experience goes even further than that? What if, in that transition, the person touches something that doesn't come from within the brain at all? Something that seems universal, timeless, or fundamental? Researchers often struggle with the consistency of near-death reports precisely because they don't align with individual identities or cultural expectations. For example, people who have no history of spiritual belief describe a sense of connection. People who never thought about existence beyond the physical describe spaces or states of being that feel more real than anything they've ever known. People who are not religious describe encounters that feel symbolic without being tied to any particular tradition. These aren't observations painted with personal belief. Quite often, they're experiences that contradict what the person believed before. That's what makes them so difficult to categorize, and yet they happen again and again across continents and languages and eras. So, when someone dies under anesthesia, even briefly, the experience may not be personal. It may tap into a larger field or structure of awareness that the brain normally separates us from. In everyday life, we perceive only what our senses and neural pathways filter. But in moments of profound transition, when those filters collapse, consciousness may expand into a kind of shared or fundamental realm that all individuals access but rarely remember. Whether this realm is metaphorical, psychological, or literal remains open to interpretation, but its consistency suggests that consciousness might not be confined to the brain alone. If that's true, the moment of death, even under anesthesia, could reveal aspects of our nature that we rarely glimpse. Now let's consider the quiet return, the moment when a person is revived and brought back from the edge. This moment, too, is mysterious in its own way. People often describe returning as though falling back into their bodies. Some say it feels like being pulled, others like being compressed, others like being dropped. These sensations suggest that the transition back into physical consciousness is not simply waking up, it's a re-entry. The brain has to reboot, re-establishing networks, rerouting blood flow, recalibrating the senses. But the person who opens their eyes is not always the same as the one who slipped away. Something shifts. The surface mind returns, but the deeper layers leave their imprint. Even people who remember nothing of the experience often say they feel different afterward, in ways they struggle to articulate. Some feel more grounded, some feel more lost, some feel more curious. Some feel as though a curtain was briefly lifted, revealing a larger reality they can no longer fully remember but still feel. It's as though the moment near death unlocked something, leaving a subtle mark that lingers long after the event itself fades. And this brings us to the final dimension, the role these experiences play in understanding the nature of awareness itself. If people near death under anesthesia describe clarity and unity rather than fragmentation or chaos, what does that say about the structure of consciousness? If they describe perception without senses, memory without the brain's usual encoding, or a feeling of identity without a body, what does that say about what we truly are? These experiences challenge the assumption that the mind is fragile or easily extinguished. Instead, they hint at a kind of resilience woven into awareness, something capable of adapting even when the physical systems falter. They suggest that the boundary between life and death is not a sudden cliff, but a threshold the mind can cross, explore, and sometimes return from. And so, after exploring all these possibilities, we are left with a strange and humbling picture that in the very moment when everything physical falls away, consciousness may open into something vast, complex, and deeply meaningful. Whether that space is internal or external, biological or fundamental, individual or universal, remains unresolved. But the experiences of those who've come close offer a window into its mystery. As we close this exploration tonight, allow your mind to settle into the quiet, knowing that awareness is far more intricate than it appears. The line between consciousness and the physical world is not rigid. It's porous, shifting, capable of surprising transitions. Just as sleep gently changes your state of awareness without ever extinguishing it, these profound thresholds may reveal that the essence of who you are is not confined to the body alone. Wherever consciousness originates, deep within the brain or beyond it, it carries a depth that continues to unfold, moment by moment, layer by layer, and as you rest, you can let that mystery remain open, like a door slightly ajar, inviting you to wonder what awareness truly is and how far it might extend beyond the boundaries we've always assumed.